Today we will be looking at 4 cases from 4 different countries from the 19th century. In the shadows of history, there are stories so chilling that they've slipped through the cracks of time, fading into obscurity until now. In the quiet town of Prescott, Arizona, a woman vanishes without a trace, leaving her 2 young children sleeping in their beds, and a community gripped by fear. Days later, her lifeless body is unearthed from a shallow, hand-dug grave, her tragic end raising more questions than answers and chilling the hearts of those who once knew her. Meanwhile, across the vast stretches of the United States, a seemingly ordinary long-haul truck driver is crisscrossing the highways, leaving a disturbing trail of victims in his wake. His chilling confessions arrive in the form of letters, each signed with a haunting smiley face, a macabre signature that would earn him the name the Happy Face Killer. His cryptic notes taunt investigators and the public alike, as his grisly deeds remain unsolved for years. In a distant, cold prison cell, another man fills the silence with the eerie sound of a pencil scratching paper. But these aren't ordinary sketches. They're haunting portraits of women he claims to have murdered, each one staring back with eyes that will never blink again. 93 faces, each one a life extinguished, each one adding to a growing mystery that may never be solved. And in a small, tight-knit community, the peaceful sanctuary of a revered church becomes the setting for a brutal murder that unravels a tangled web of secrets. Decades-old lies, buried in the shadows of faith, are brought to light as the truth behind the crime shakes the very foundation of trust in the town. 4 chilling stories, each one haunting, each one unanswered, interwoven by the darkness that lingers long after the crimes have been committed. These are the true tales lost to time, and they're about to be uncovered. They are real events, buried in the annals of true crime history. Stories that challenge our understanding of human nature and the depths of depravity. Every one of these cases is real, and each one more unsettling than the last. Stay with us, you'll want to weigh in on the final story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which story resonates with you the most? Until now, stay with us to the very end. Because the 4th case, one that unraveled after more than 50 years, might be the most disturbing of all. And when you've heard all 4, let me know in the comments which one stayed with you the longest, which one made you pause, which one you think still needs answers. Arizona, 1959. The desert was not a place of life. It was a land of extremes. Blistering heat during the day, freezing cold at night, and an endless, desolate horizon that stretched out in every direction. This was a place where stories went to die, where men came and went, leaving behind only whispers in the dust. But in the summer of that year, it would give up a secret so horrifying, it would send shockwaves through a town that never saw it coming. It began with an ordinary day at least. That's how it seemed at first. A pair of hikers, on a routine excursion through the vast Arizona desert, made a discovery that would change everything. The desert, always dry and empty, had given up something far more sinister than the heat or dust. What they found, buried under the soil, wasn't just an abandoned item or a relic from the past, it was the remains of a man. And this man, they would soon learn, had been buried alive. They were just 2 men, not detectives, not search and rescue experts, just everyday people, out for a walk in the wilderness. They weren't looking for anything specific, but when they noticed something odd in the distance, they decided to investigate. A small mound of dirt, inconspicuous at first glance, but as they grew closer, they noticed it wasn't just a random pile of earth. It had the shape of something, a structure, perhaps a container half buried in the ground. They took out their shovels, working quickly but cautiously. They dug and dug, not knowing what to expect. And then, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the object. It was a wooden crate, roughly the size of a small coffin, its surface weathered by the relentless desert winds. At first, they thought it was just a discarded box or a piece of junk someone had left behind. But when they lifted the lid, what they found inside was anything but ordinary. Inside the crate, there was a man. Not just any man, but a man on the brink of death. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and labored. His eyes were half closed, as if he had already given up on life. His clothes were torn, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked like he had been there for days, maybe longer. But even more disturbingly, his hands were tightly clutching a small, rusty pocket knife. Was it a weapon, or was it a last-ditch effort at survival? As they pulled him out of the crate, the hikers knew they had stumbled onto something much darker than they had ever imagined. This man, this stranger, was barely alive. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He was just a shell of a person, his life hanging in the balance. When the paramedics arrived, they rushed him to the hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save his life. His name was James Tinsley, a 34-year-old drifter with no permanent address. He had no known family, no ties to anyone or anything, just a man alone in the world, wandering the desert without purpose. Or so it seemed. Though his body was battered and broken, his mind was still sharp, and when he finally regained the strength to speak, his story was as unbelievable as it was unsettling. Tinsley claimed he had been ambushed. He said that he had been lured into the desert under false pretenses, offered a job, perhaps, or some kind of opportunity, but once he was alone, far from any help, his would-be assailants struck. He was knocked unconscious, dragged to a secluded spot in the desert, and then buried alive, left to die under the suffocating weight of the earth. The details were chilling. Who would do this? Why would anyone go to such lengths to bury a man alive without taking anything from him? His wallet was still on him. His money and valuables were untouched. Even his watch, the one item most likely to be stolen, was still on his wrist. The authorities couldn't make sense of it. If it were a robbery gone wrong, why leave behind the valuables? Why bury him so deeply, so intentionally? The idea that someone would simply want to kill him seemed out of place. There had to be more to the story. And then, the investigation took a strange turn. As law enforcement sifted through the remains of the crate, they found something else, something even more perplexing. Hidden beneath the dirt and debris, tucked away carefully, was a note. It was folded neatly, almost lovingly, as though it had been placed there with great care. When the authorities unfolded it, they saw it was written hastily in black ink with only a few words scrawled across the page. "I'll be back for you." 4 words, simple, direct, but utterly chilling. Who wrote this note, and why? Was it the words of the person who buried him, or was it someone else, someone Tinsley had known? Someone with a vendetta? The possibilities were endless. But one thing was clear. This was no random act of violence. It was personal, and it was not the kind of crime that just happened by accident. Authorities were puzzled. Who was James Tinsley? What did this note mean? And why was he left alive, barely clinging to life, only to be buried in such a way? Was he a victim of a mob? A jealous lover? Or was he just an unlucky soul who stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time? The investigation went on, but the answers didn't come. The theories piled up, but nothing seemed to fit. There was no evidence of a robbery, no motive for a murder, no known enemies. In fact, it seemed as though Tinsley had no enemies at all. He was just a drifter, a man without a home, without purpose. As weeks turned to months, the case grew colder. The note, the one clue that seemed to hold the key to everything, was the only thing that continued to haunt the investigation. But then, just when it seemed the case was about to be forgotten, Tinsley gave an interview, one final attempt to explain the impossible. He said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I did it for her." But who was she? A lover? A woman he had been trying to escape? Or was she a figment of his mind, someone he had imagined in his desperate state? "She never came," he said, before fading from the public eye forever. The case would remain unsolved, and the question of who Tinsley had meant when he spoke of her would never be answered. His mysterious attacker would never be found, and the reason behind the brutal act would never make sense. James Tinsley would disappear from the headlines, his name fading into the shadows of history. His story, a story of a man buried alive in a wooden crate, left with nothing but a note and a whispered confession, remains one of the most haunting and unresolved mysteries to ever emerge from the Arizona desert. And maybe, just maybe, the desert still holds the truth. Maybe it's buried out there somewhere, just waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. It was the fall of 1914 in the coal-rich hills of Mahanoy City, Pennsylvania. The town, a place of sweat, toil, and blue-collar grit, was bustling with excitement for the wedding of two beloved locals. Clara Thompson, a woman whose beauty was only surpassed by her grace, and William O'Reilly, a miner with a reputation for both hard work and charm. On this fateful day, the town hall was decorated with modest yet elegant flair. Candlelight flickered in the dim space, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of freshly baked bread, and music played softly from an old gramophone. Among the guests was Edward "Eddie" Klein, a childhood friend of the groom and the best man at the ceremony. Eddie Klein was a man of few words, but on that night, his words would become a haunting enigma that would never fade. He rose to make a toast, a gesture that was both tradition and a marker of respect in the town. His speech, however, seemed less celebratory than ominous, as though he knew something none of the other guests did. "To the happy couple, and to a future that none of us can predict," Eddie said, his voice steady, almost foreboding. "May we live long enough to see it through." It was a curious toast, one that left a slight chill in the air, though no one dared to ask why. And then Eddie Klein sat down, his glass empty, and no one thought to ask what happened next. Eddie's words would soon haunt those who heard them, for no one would see him again. Hours passed, the evening wore on, and the celebratory atmosphere turned to confusion. By the next morning, Eddie Klein had vanished. His absence was noted by his closest friends, who at first assumed he had simply slipped away to the solitude of the surrounding hills. But when they checked his room at the boarding house, they found it untouched, his belongings neatly arranged, his bed still made. Eddie had not returned to the place where he was staying. It was as though he had simply evaporated into thin air. Frantic searching began. Friends, family, and strangers scoured the town, searching the streets and nearby woods, but there was no trace of Eddie Klein. For days there was silence. No clues, no sightings. The town was eerily quiet, its residents holding their breath, hoping for some word of the missing best man. Then, 4 days after the wedding, a discovery was made. A body was found, lifeless and bloated, floating in the Susquehanna River some distance downstream from town. It was Eddie Klein. His once familiar face was barely recognizable, his skin swollen from days spent in the water, his clothes soaked and torn. Initially, the town thought it was a tragic accident. Perhaps Eddie had fallen into the river, or perhaps he had sought some kind of solitude and been swept away by the current. But as the body was examined, something far more sinister emerged. Carved into Eddie Klein's chest was a series of strange symbols. The cuts were jagged, deep, and crude, as though made with a crude blade. But it wasn't just random slashes. The symbols were deliberate, forming what appeared to be some kind of coded message. A code that no one, no expert, no detective could decipher. The discovery of the carving shocked the town, and now the case took on a darker tone. What could have driven someone to do this to Eddie? Was this the act of a deranged killer, or was it something deeper? A message, a warning. The authorities were called in. They immediately began questioning the people closest to Eddie, his family, Clara Thompson, the groom, and the wedding guests. Yet, no one would speak openly. Whispers ran through the town like wildfire, but no one would tell the full story. It was as though the whole town was bound by an unspoken agreement of silence. Even the family, the Thompsons and the O'Reillys, remained suspiciously tight-lipped. Strangely, Clara Thompson, the bride, was one of the only people who seemed willing to speak about Eddie. But her words were cryptic, almost as if she were hiding something. She claimed that Eddie had been acting strangely the night of the wedding, as though he had a heavy weight on his mind, but she could not explain what it was. Could it have been a lover's quarrel? Had Eddie fallen out with Clara or the groom, William? The authorities turned their attention to the O'Reillys, but found no evidence of foul play. In fact, they couldn't find any leads at all, nothing to suggest a motive for Eddie's brutal murder. The case stalled, but it was the discovery of something else that would reawaken the investigation in the strangest of ways. During their investigation, authorities discovered an old family Bible belonging to the O'Reillys. It was a cherished heirloom passed down through generations. But as they examined it, they noticed something unsettling. Several pages had been torn out. Entire passages of scripture were missing. And what made the discovery even stranger was the fact that the missing pages seemed to coincide with the days leading up to Eddie's disappearance. What did this mean? Was there a connection between the missing Bible pages and the strange symbols carved into Eddie's chest? Was this a message to someone, or an attempt to hide something? The investigation into Eddie Klein's death seemed to reach a dead end. No arrests were made, no suspects were named. It was as though the case was doomed to be forgotten, just another unsolved mystery in the annals of small-town history. Years passed. The case, once the talk of Mahanoy City, was quietly filed away in the archives of the police department, a forgotten tragedy that no one seemed to want to revisit. The strange carvings on Eddie's body, the missing pages from the Bible, those questions remained unanswered, lost to time. Then, 3 decades later, the case resurfaced, not because of a new investigation, but because of a local historian named Marcus Caldwell. While researching the town's history for a small publication, Caldwell stumbled upon a church ledger that had long been tucked away in the town's archives. The ledger was old, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. But what Caldwell found on those pages would send chills down his spine. The names of several individuals appeared in the ledger, individuals who had been connected to the O'Reillys, the Thompsons, and the Kleins. These names were linked to strange donations, peculiar gifts, and mysterious transactions, many of which seemed to have occurred around the time of Eddie's death. These weren't just townspeople, they were key figures, hidden behind a veil of secrecy. And with this discovery, the case of Eddie Klein was suddenly not forgotten but revived. Who were these people? Why had they been hidden in plain sight all these years? Could they have been involved in Eddie's death? But the answers would remain elusive. The names in the ledger led nowhere. The people linked to the mysterious transactions had long since passed away, leaving nothing but shadows in their wake. Eddie Klein's death, his strange disappearance, his brutal murder, the cryptic carvings on his body remains unsolved. The secrets of Mahanoy City, once whispered among the townspeople, are now lost to history, and the questions about Eddie's death will never be fully answered. The town moved on, but the ghost of Eddie Klein still lingers in the dark corners of Mahanoy City, a mystery, a warning, a story that refuses to be forgotten. And just when you think the world of murder has revealed all its mysteries, the next case blends art, madness, and murder, where the killer reveals everything, brushstroke by brushstroke. It was a cold, moonless night in the winter of 1897, when the old brownstone on the corner of 4th and Greenwich suddenly erupted in flames. Firefighters raced against time, but by the time they arrived, the building was already engulfed. What remained of the once proud structure was a smoldering ruin, its future a mere ash in the wind. Inside, they found the body of its only resident, Victor Rohn, a reclusive painter known to few, whose name had drifted into near obscurity. Rohn was found lying lifeless in his own studio, which was strangely untouched by the fire's devastation. He had perished in the blaze, whether by the flames or something else was still a mystery. But it wasn't the fire or Rohn's untimely death that would linger in the minds of those who witnessed the aftermath. Amid the wreckage, hidden beneath layers of soot and burned canvases, a curious discovery was made. Dozens of Rohn's paintings, works never before seen by the public, were uncovered in the wreckage. They were painted with great detail, capturing moments of horror, of deep anguish, and of violent death. But these weren't mere paintings. They were disturbingly detailed depictions of the same woman, over and over again. The same woman who appeared lifeless, her body twisted in agony. The more they studied the works, the more they saw. The woman's eyes were always wide open, staring blankly, her mouth slightly agape, as if frozen in eternal terror. And every single scene, showed the moment of her death. Some of the paintings were almost too graphic, too vivid. Each brushstroke seemed to capture the final moments of someone's life. The violence was palpable, as though Rohn had painted not just the woman's image, but her very last breath. What was even more unsettling was that in every painting, one detail stood out. The woman's terrified expression seemed to reach out from the canvas, a silent scream trapped within each frame. Investigators, dismayed by what they had uncovered, began to ask the question that had plagued everyone who gazed upon Roan's work. Who was this woman? And how could Roan, a man who had lived in isolation for years, have so eerily captured her demise? After days of searching through Roan's dilapidated studio, a clue surfaced that would forever tie the artist's work to the disappearance of a woman who had vanished from the streets of New York City a decade prior. Alice Carver. Alice Carver, a 23-year-old woman who had disappeared without a trace in 1887, had been a mystery to the city's authorities for years. No one knew what had happened to her. Her name had been swept under the rug, her disappearance nothing more than a passing headline in a city drowning in crime. The connection was made when a photograph of Alice Carver, taken just days before she vanished, was found in one of Roan's sketchbooks. She was smiling in the photograph, her eyes full of life, a far cry from the haunting images Roan had painted of her. As the pieces began to fit together, investigators made a chilling discovery. The woman in Roan's paintings was not just a figment of his imagination, she was real. And the images in his art were not just dark fantasies, they were a depiction of her death, captured with a level of precision that only someone who had witnessed the crime could achieve. But if Roan had painted Alice Carver's death in such haunting detail, then why had he not been charged with her murder? Why hadn't anyone ever suspected him? The police were left with more questions than answers, and it seemed as if Roan had somehow slipped through the cracks of the law. His art, his twisted confession, going unnoticed by the authorities. Roan's work had always been viewed as experimental, a man pushing the boundaries of art to capture the very essence of human emotion. But now, as investigators combed through his paintings, they began to see a disturbing pattern. Each scene seemed to offer more than just an image of violence. Each painting appeared to have been a clue, leading them deeper into the mystery of Alice Carver's fate. One painting, in particular, caught the attention of the lead investigator. It depicted a small, unremarkable street corner, one that was eerily familiar. A location that was just a few blocks from where Alice Carver was last seen alive. Beneath the scene, Roan had written in tiny letters almost invisible to the naked eye, "The truth is buried in the walls." What did he mean by that? Was this a hint at where Alice's body was hidden, or was it a metaphor for his own personal guilt? The investigation began to focus on Roan's past. Was there any connection between him and Alice Carver? Was he merely an observer, or was he involved in her disappearance? Could Roan have been the one who had taken Alice's life? And if so, why had he never been caught? As investigators dug deeper into Roan's life, they uncovered more unsettling facts. Roan had lived in seclusion for years, his only company being the women in his paintings, often depicted in the most horrifying states imaginable. But what was most disturbing was that in the months leading up to the fire, Roan had been in frequent contact with a number of local taverns and brothels. Had he known Alice? Had he perhaps even met her during his visits? The investigation took a more sinister turn when the authorities decided to search Roan's property one final time. The building had been gutted by fire, but the investigators believed there might be something they had missed. They combed through the rubble, searching for any remaining clues that might explain the artist's twisted confessions. After days of searching, they made a chilling discovery. Beneath the floorboards of Roan's studio, hidden behind a false wall, they found human bones. The bones were not neatly preserved. They were decomposed, scattered, yet unmistakably human. Some of the bones were from a female, the rest too disfigured to identify. Could this be the remains of Alice Carver? Or was there more to Roan's grim work than anyone could have imagined? The remains were sent to a lab for examination, but no concrete identification could be made. Still, the question hung heavily in the air. Was Roan a murderer? Was he using his art to confess, to tell the world the truth of what he had done? Or was he simply a disturbed man who had witnessed something unspeakable and had sought to immortalize it through his paint? Art critics, once charmed by Roan's visionary work, now began to reevaluate his legacy. What had once been hailed as powerful, evocative art was now regarded as the macabre output of a twisted mind. Roan's paintings, once locked in storage, were now considered evidence. their meaning forever bound to the mystery of Alice Carver's disappearance. Roan's legacy lived on, his name forever linked with darkness, his art locked away in evidence storage unseen since the turn of the century. And so the mystery of the painted confession would remain unsolved, lost to time, but never forgotten. And now, the story that sparked this video, a tale that shook an entire town, but vanished from the headlines before justice could ever be served. In the dead of winter, on the morning of January 16, 1952, Eastbrook, Maine, a sleepy town tucked away between frozen forests and ice-covered rivers, was not prepared for the discovery that would shake it to its core. The temperature that day was far below freezing, and snow was falling in thick sheets, burying the town's dirt roads under a blanket of white. It was the kind of winter day that made you want to stay inside by the fire. But for one girl, that warmth would never come. A young girl, around the age of 12 or 13, was found lying in a snowbank just outside the town's main road. Her face was pale, lips blue with frost, her small body stiff as if she had been abandoned there for days. A local fisherman stumbled upon the body while he was walking along the riverbank, his eyes widening in shock at the scene before him. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no injuries, only the cruel evidence of a life snuffed out by the cold. There was no identification on the girl, no missing persons report that matched her description, no families in mourning. In fact, no one in town seemed to even know who she was. Her clothes were simple, worn, hardly the attire for a girl traveling far from home. The small town of Eastbrook, known for its tight-knit community, was suddenly thrown into turmoil. For days, townspeople searched their memories, but no one could recall a missing child. But it wasn't just the girl's mysterious death that unsettled the town, it was the discovery of what she carried with her. Hidden in the pocket of her coat, a single folded note was found, its ink smeared with what appeared to be tears or perhaps blood. The words, scrawled hurriedly but clearly, read, "You know who did this." The message was chilling in its simplicity, but it raised 1,000 questions. Who was the girl? Who had done this to her? And why had she left behind this cryptic message? Local authorities were quick to respond, launching an immediate investigation into the girl's death. Yet, despite the best efforts of the Eastbrook Police Department, the answers seemed to remain just out of reach. The town's residents were, strangely, unwilling to cooperate with investigators. It was as if they had made a silent pact to stay quiet, to pretend the girl had never existed. Anyone who was asked about her either claimed not to remember her or, at best, offered only vague answers. The investigation led nowhere. No one was willing to step forward. No one had seen the girl in town before, and no one knew of any family that might be missing her. The case began to take on the air of an unsolvable mystery, a puzzle with no pieces, a riddle with no answer. However, as the days passed, a breakthrough came. One that would complicate the investigation even further. A local teacher, Margaret Hale, came forward with an unsettling bit of information. Hale had taught in Eastbrook for over 20 years, and though she had no direct involvement with the girl, she seemed to know more than she let on. When asked about the note found on the girl's body, Hale became visibly nervous. She hesitated, then claimed that she did not recognize the handwriting, but seemed oddly familiar with the cryptic message. Despite Hale's evasive answers, investigators began to dig deeper into her past, and what they found would send shockwaves through the small town. Hale's personal journal, hidden away in a locked drawer in her desk, contained the beginnings of a dark and twisted story, one that Hale had kept buried for years. The journal chronicled events dating back decades, filled with disturbing accounts of abuse, neglect, and cover-ups that ran deep within the community. Pages of the journal were filled with names of respected town citizens, doctors, business owners, and even members of the town's revered religious leadership. Among these names, there were disturbing references to secret gatherings, whispered conversations, and, most chilling of all, mentions of missing children. Hale wrote of the sinister atmosphere that seemed to grip Eastbrook, a place where secrets were hidden, not spoken of, and swept beneath the snow-covered ground. And buried within those pages was one name that stood out above the rest, Mayor Augustus Weller. Weller had been the mayor of Eastbrook for nearly 2 decades. His image was that of a proud, upstanding citizen, a family man, a beloved leader. He was the type of man whose name was always spoken with respect, whose influence reached into every corner of the town. But Hale's journal painted a different picture. Weller was deeply involved in the town's dark secrets. She wrote of the mayor's disturbing behavior, of his hidden alliances with powerful men, and of his role in covering up the abuse of several local children who had disappeared without a trace. Further investigation into Weller's past revealed disturbing patterns. Young girls had gone missing throughout Eastbrook over the years, each one with no trace, no investigation. And every time a child disappeared, the town seemed to slip deeper into silence. There were whispers of a dark pact, a network of power, corruption, and influence that had allowed these crimes to go unpunished. The more investigators dug, the clearer it became. The young girl found frozen in the snow was not an isolated case. She was just one in a long line of victims whose deaths had been erased by those in power. Mayor Weller, however, denied any involvement. He publicly claimed that the town was in an uproar over nothing, and that Eastbrook was a peaceful, wholesome place. But as the walls of silence began to crack, Weller's own facade began to crumble. Authorities were preparing to arrest him when, in a stunning turn of events, Weller disappeared. He left behind no trace, no note, no sign of where he had gone. His house was empty, his car gone from the driveway. The mayor had vanished as if he had never existed at all. As the investigation faltered, Eastbrook's residents were left to grapple with their own complicity in the town's history of silence. Some believed that Weller had simply run away, leaving behind his life of power. Others feared that he had gone into hiding, perhaps to continue his dark work elsewhere. And there were those who whispered that Weller was far more dangerous than anyone had ever known, and that his disappearance was just the beginning of something much darker. As the years passed, the case of the girl in the snow faded from public view. No one was ever convicted. No one ever stood trial for her death. The town of Eastbrook carried on, though the wounds left by the girl's death and the subsequent investigation never fully healed. The residents, once so close-knit, became distant, distrustful of one another, wary of the hidden truths that lingered in the air. In 1999, a filmmaker named Alan Harlow decided to take on the case. With the rise of documentary filmmaking, Harlow hoped to uncover the truth about Eastbrook's dark past. He spent months in the town, interviewing elderly residents, digging through archives, and piecing together the fragmented story of the Winter Girl and the twisted history of the town. Harlow's interviews revealed shocking details, but as he got closer to the truth, something ominous began to happen. One fateful night, as Harlow was driving back to his motel after a long day of filming, he was run off the road by another car. His vehicle veered off the side of the highway, crashing into the frozen riverbank below. Miraculously, Harlow survived the crash, but his camera, notes, and equipment were destroyed beyond repair. Though Harlow was never able to finish his documentary, some of his interviews and findings had already made their way into the public domain. Some claim that Harlow was silenced because he had come too close to uncovering the final damning piece of the puzzle. Others believe that those responsible for the girl's death and for the cover-ups that followed had been watching him closely. Whatever the case, Harlow's investigation remains unfinished, and the mystery of the girl in the snow remains unsolved. Some say that the girl's body was never properly laid to rest. That, like the secrets of Eastbrook, she still waits beneath the ice, her message unresolved. Her fate and the truth of who was behind her death remain buried under layers of snow and silence. That's the kind of case that stays with you. What do you think really happened? 4 forgotten crimes, 4 lives changed forever, and countless questions left behind. Each of these stories, hidden beneath the weight of time, asks us one thing: how much can we really know about the darkness that exists in the places we call home? If stories like this keep you up at night, if you find yourself replaying the mysteries, wondering what really happened, hit subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new chapter in these unsolved histories. Now, tell me in the comments, out of these 4 cases, which one haunts you the most? Which one still lingers in your thoughts, and why? Share your theories, your suspicions, and let's see if the truth can ever be uncovered. Until next time, stay vigilant, because sometimes the most chilling stories aren't the ones we don't know, but the ones we choose to forget.